Hi everyone, I'm your host, Tom Spare, and welcome to Spare Report, the podcast where I focus on the people and organisations whose work often goes underreported or is misrepresented in the media. This is the fourth and final episode of Going Spare in the USA. Over this mini-series, I've been sharing my trip reflections and the sounds of the four cities I visited whilst out in the US in October and November 2024. New York City, New Orleans, Atlanta, and Washington, D.C. This is part 4, Election Night in D.C. My United Airlines flight from Atlanta, Georgia, made its final descent towards Dulles International Airport, Washington, D.C. As the plane came to a standstill, I looked out of my window to see the fiery sky mix into a vibrant pink. I took a taxi to the Moxie Hotel on 111 K Street Northwest, followed swiftly by the dark cloak of night. After checking in and grabbing a quick bite to eat, I did what any student of politics, current or former, would do. I headed straight towards the White House. The streets of the nation's capital were eerily quiet. The street lamps seemed dimmer, the night sky dark and brooding. About a block out from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, I noticed the start of a perimeter fence surrounding federal government buildings. I turned the corner to find that same perimeter fence extended to and surrounding the White House, the fence obscuring the famed front lawn. The authorities were not taking any chances. There were genuine concerns of riots and unrest in the streets. The spectre of January the 6th, Capitol riots, still cast a long shadow over America. As I looked on at the White House obscured by a perimeter fencing, my gaze landed on a curious sight. To my left, two tired and disinterested Trump supporters were limply waving banners and seated. On the opposing side of the square, several Harris-Walz supporters waved their banners. In between the two parties, in the centre of the square, stood two large crosses, one illuminated, firmly placed to the ground, the other plain, resting against its owner's shoulder. The two crosses were surrounded by young people singing Bible songs and playing guitar. My Redeemer lives, yes he does. My eyes were drawn to the illuminated cross, bright in comparison to the gloomy sky above and the shrouded White House behind. In a country where there was a heady mix of God, faith and politics, I could not help but think about the number of times the word and name of God had been slipped into politicians' speeches on both sides of the aisle. God bless America? I wasn't so sure in that moment. As I walked back to my hotel, I pondered whether this was the end of the American experiment. Was this the moment that American power capitulated? Washington, D.C. was modelled on Athens and Rome, the classical world. Was I walking along the streets of an empire soon to end? Would this election mark the fall of the American empire? I remember getting back to my bedroom and shaking my head in disbelief, trying to process the scene and the thoughts that had come into my head. I let out a troubled laugh. Restless, I took the lift up to the top floor of the hotel. The roof terrace gave views across the city, the Washington Monument poking out between the steel and glass buildings of the nation's capital. I ordered a drink, knocked it back swiftly, and headed to bed. The next day was bound to be eventful. The 5th of November, Election Day. I headed up to Georgetown University to meet a member of staff who I'd connected with via an old uni friend of mine. We went out for lunch to talk about Palestine and their efforts to raise money for people in Gaza, their experience visiting the region, and as a way for me to understand the wider history and context of the conflict. From that conversation, I booked a visit to have a tour of the Museum of Palestinian People in DC that would be taking place the following day. Afterwards, I spent some time walking around campus, thinking about the conversation we'd just had. A university student band was playing songs for people who had voted. The band had a list, you picked a song and they played it. Here's a clip of a song you might recognise. Georgetown is the oldest Catholic and Jesuit institution of higher learning in the United States, founded by John Carroll in 1789, the time that coincides with the birth of the nation. In 1838, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, sold more than 272 enslaved individuals for the university's benefit. With the university's support, working with the Maryland province of Jesuits who were responsible for the selling of the slaves, and the descendants of the 272 enslaved individuals have set up the Descendants Truth and Reconciliation Foundation to take a leading role in addressing the legacies of enslavement in the United States and its impact on families and communities today. The vision is to turn the foundation into a $1 billion institution. The Civil War almost closed the school down. A total of 1,141 students and alumni served in both the Union and Confederate forces. The university's official colours, blue and grey, were chosen to mark the end of the war in 1876, a poignant reminder of a time when both the nation and the university were deeply divided. Despite this early turmoil, Georgetown has always shown a willingness to change with the nation. In the 1870s, its president, Patrick F. Healy, became the first African-American to lead a major US university. Women were first allowed to enroll in the School of Foreign Service in 1944, and then were fully accepted into the college for the first time in 1969, a pivotal year for social change. Students demonstrated against the Vietnam War and redirected that energy into positive social action, which they continue to do to this day. Today, Georgetown has grown into a major international research university with a budget of over $1.8 billion, with over 5,300 academic and administrative staff and just over 20,000 students. Exploring Georgetown, I tried to take in the incredible campus around me. However, I was troubled. Across the United States, millions of people were casting their ballots. But I had this niggling feeling that the die had already been cast. Trump was going to win. He was the bigger name. He had a fervent supporter base. He made the Republican Party and the political machine around it into his own image. He was surrounded by determined, loyal yes people willing to do his bidding. Behind him had a substantive conservative plan through the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Project 2025 looked to reshape the remaining liberal US political, civic, and educational institutions into conservative vehicles for change. Trump was up against Kamala Harris, who had been the Democratic nominee for just 107 days, whose name was less known despite holding the title of vice president, and whose own VP nominee, Governor Tim Walz, was a relative unknown. They were inheriting a mighty campaign apparatus with a lot of money and celebrity endorsements behind them. But they were also inheriting the record of an unpopular administration, an unpopular president, with a controversial foreign policy record and a badly explained domestic agenda. And although my head was transmitting all of this to me, that Trump was going to win, my heart ached for a different result. The first black female president. A chance for a Democratic nominee who was younger, more dynamic, more accessible, to realign the agenda of the administration and to keep out an extreme and nativist opposition. There were plenty of posters of Harris and Walz. You wouldn't expect any less from a university in the nation's capital, one of the bluest areas in America. But as I departed the campus, I had this growing feeling of dread, a feeling I'd not been able to shake during my whole trip. This election had been lost many months prior when Joe Biden uttered those first few wispy words on that debate stage back in June. The vote had been tied up in many states when a gunman was in earshot of Biden's predecessor, Trump. I took a taxi back to the Moxie Hotel to pick up my suitcase. From there, I headed over to the Washington Hotel, a stone's throw, and literally over the road, from the White House. I checked in and rested. After a late dinner, I got a taxi over to Union Pub on 201 Massachusetts Avenue Northeast in the shadow of the Capitol building to watch the election night play out in real time. When I arrived at the Union Pub around 9:30 p.m, the place was packed out. I didn't even bother trying to get to the bar, and I was cramped in a corner. I watched the dual screen showing CNN and Fox News. The Liberal commentators started the night confident, the Conservatives a little sheepish and uncertain. As I was watching the TV screens, trying not to get in the way, a cameraman and a news presenter set up right in front of me. I pressed myself into the nook in a wall as the presenter pressed a finger on his earpiece and then flicked through messages on his phone. Someone in the pub recognised the presenter. He gestured to keep things quiet. He needed to be in and out very quickly. The cameraman nodded his head. The presenter drew up a microphone to his lips and started his piece to camera. He then seemed to move backwards and disappeared into the next room, his colleague following suit. After the presenter and his colleague had left the pub, I headed over to the bar to grab a drink. At the bar, I got talking to 3 Georgetown University students. One student was English, the other 2 were Indian. I had little insight to offer on election night itself other than the talking points I'd picked up online and on TV, plus a couple of modules from my undergraduate degree over a decade earlier. This was enough to make me the table's de facto expert on US politics. The results were rolling in, the pendulum was swinging, and a winner was beginning to emerge. When North Carolina was called, that was it. What had been a packed bar when I'd arrived a couple of hours earlier was now starting to thin out. In Democrat DC, the 45th president becoming the 47th was unwelcome news. The students I'd spent the last hour or so with had no interest in staying to see Trump do any sort of speech. We said our goodbyes and they left. I remained in the bar until closing time. Later, in my hotel, I watched Trump's victory speech. There was a huge cast of characters behind him, including family members, close allies, and an odd assortment of right-wing celebrities. It was as if Trump was collecting a Golden Globe or an Emmy, and he was thanking his producing partners and the writers and the other actors. Trump had completed the greatest comeback of modern political times. He'd won the popular vote, making gains in almost every part of the United States. He'd won the Electoral College, and he was likely to win the Congress too. With a conservative Supreme Court, Trump had completed the hat-trick, controlling the White House, the legislature, and the courts. He had everything he needed to reshape the United States of America. Messages started to pour in on my phone. Everyone back home was in shock. The result had come as no shock to me, although it was still difficult to process. When I arrived in the US on the 25th of October, I could see Trump was doing well. Polling was remaining steady going into the last couple of weeks. He was ahead in the swing states. I thought at the time he would win the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. But after his Madison Square Garden rally, the wheels seemed to come off his campaign and Harris surged. On the TV, I saw a lot of people speculating that Harris was gaining momentum. There was a growing confidence across the Democratic apparatus. I stayed up for another couple of hours before finally calling it quits. 6th of November, the day after Election Day. After very little sleep, I got up, had breakfast in the hotel and headed out for the first destination of the day, the Capitol building. It was a bright, warm morning. The US Capitol was relatively quiet. Another day in the city's storied history. I was still sleepy from watching the results until the early hours. I listened to the newsagent's podcast. It was reassuring to hear the voices of John, Emily, and Lewis as I walked towards the Capitol building. I was not able to visit the building during my last trip as public access was restricted following the January 6th storming by Trump supporters. It is the place where Congress go to meet, debate, and vote on legislation. And a little history about the Capitol building. Construction of the Capitol began in 1793. What's now the north and south wings were completed by 1807, but the building's history is marked by a dramatic moment of conflict. The British burned the Capitol to the ground during the War of 1812. The centre portion of the building was completed in 1826, but as the country expanded, so too did the Capitol. In the 1850s, the building had to grow to make room for new representatives and senators. Both its wings and its famous dome were enlarged, and later its east and west fronts were expanded. In a way, the capital's story of growth and expansion mirrors the country it represents. Today, it's still a working office building and home to the land's most powerful legislative body. It's also a place where people from all over the world come to learn about the American democracy that they'd all heard so much about. It's a constant physical reminder of the country's past and its ongoing journey, which felt particularly apt the day after such a monumental election. I booked a slot to have a tour of the building. The large atrium was filled with a statue from each of the 50 states, statues of notable and accomplished people who represent the best of a given state. As I stood outside the auditorium waiting for the introductory video presentation to begin, I noticed fellow visitors taking photos of one particular statue. It was a man looking down at the floor, one hand holding a strap across his chest, wearing a long jacket with slicked over hair. He had a guitar by his side. When I got closer, I was able to read the inscription in the stone. It read, Arkansas, Johnny Cash, 1932 to 2003. Singer, songwriter, artist, humanitarian. The doors of the auditorium opened. The visitors and I entered the large lecture theatre. Once we were all settled, a member of Capitol building staff came out to give a short introduction before a video was projected onto a cinema-sized screen. During the video, we were given a short, staring history of the United States, its violent founding, the recognition of its expansion and illegal settling on its first people's land, and the Civil War that nearly finished the Union for good. By the end of the presentation, I was reassured to have the election result put into perspective and thought back to what Dr. King had said. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. After the presentation, we were each given headsets with tours available in various languages. Each group had a guide who spoke directly into our headsets. This was by far the most effective way for a tour guide to speak to such a large group of people in a very big space. Our guide proceeded to take us down into the belly of the building to show parts of the first iteration. It was grand, but a lot smaller, darker, and more reminiscent of walking in the halls of the Palace of Westminster in London. The Capitol building sat at the centre of the four-section grid of Washington, D.C., the guide explained. She pointed to a mark that represented both the literal point of the building and the geographical centre of the whole of Washington, D.C. All roads led to the Capitol building.
So again, please do not stop right there at the steps. We need you to please keep moving into the room. Find a place right in front of this painting.
After the tour, I got tickets to sit in both the Senate and the House of Representatives galleries. I was barred from taking my phone inside, but it was an incredible privilege to be in the place where so many consequential moments in not just US, but world history too had taken place. I took in the various exhibitions in the Capitol building, had lunch, and headed outside. Several hours had passed, my eyes adjusting to the bright DC sun. I recorded a brief video of my reflections from the US election. Here's a clip from that recording. The results yesterday will mean significant changes for people in the United States, but also across the world. It's too early to tell what this will mean, but there will be lots of changes because with the presidency, the Senate, and potentially the House of Representatives all going to the Republicans, this means that they have a complete set in the legislature and the executive, the presidency, as well as in the Supreme Court. Mass legislation is probably going to be on the horizon of lots of things relating to the women's right to choose, immigration, climate change, big cornerstone issues that affect so many people. I'm fearful for the people that I know and love that are from minority groups and underrepresented groups. I think there's a lot of people that are very scared at the moment. But I do believe in moments of great change like the ones that we experienced yesterday, these seismic moments in history, can actually generate surprising coalitions of people that you wouldn't think would be coming together in times of change. And I think also it should encourage people to go into service, into government, into volunteering. And while I've been on my travels, I've been to lots of places while I've been in the United States, in New York, New Orleans, Atlanta, and here in DC. I've seen that sort of cast across many different ways. Firstly, in the hospitality of the people. Everywhere I've gone, I've been very welcomed. I suppose I'm quite a curiosity curiosity being English. And I say English even though I've lived in Wales for 10 years, so even your identity changes when you're in different places around the world. I think also it's worth bearing in mind the huge size of the country. So I travelled, 3,500 miles to get here, to get to New York, and then I've done another 3,000 miles in travelling from the places that I have done. It's a huge country, very diverse. Every state has its own personality. It's like its own little country. So when we talk about the United States of America, it's a very complex thing. And having visited the state capital and the history of this place, it's important to remember that too. My thoughts are with all the people that didn't win yesterday, and there'll be people that are hurting. But I think the most positive reaction you can have is to care for the people that are around you, to check in with them, but also to be an active citizen, to be an active volunteer, to serve, to join government, to join a political party, movements, to be an activist. They're the things that can make huge change. And the two people that I want to sort of finish on really is when I was in Atlanta, I visited the Jimmy Carter Center and the Presidential Center and also the Martin Luther King National Park. Both of those people, President Jimmy Carter, who was president 1977 to 1981, and Martin Luther King, who was a central figure in the civil rights movement, were people from pretty, Jimmy Carter, very humble beginnings, Martin Luther King, quite middle class by the standards of the time. If we think about Jimmy Carter, he was the son of a peanut farmer. If we talk about Martin Luther King, he was the grandson of someone that was born around the Emancipation Proclamation, whose great-grandparents were slaves. And in the space of 2 generations, you had Martin Luther King Jr. going to university, becoming a minister and playing a key role in the civil rights movement. Jimmy Carter obviously went into politics after becoming after being a farmer and serving in the US Navy. And actually his most successful achievements came after his presidency, where he won the Nobel Peace Prize, where he's played a really key part in building communities, healthcare around the world, and being a real source of inspiration. Both of these two people achieved huge things outside of government, and I think this is a really important thing to remember, that government is one aspect of politics. But there's also lots of other elements that you can get involved. You don't have to be an elected official to help change your community, help change your state, your country, and potentially change the world. So that's the message I'd go with you today. I think it's really important to rest, to understand what went wrong, what went right for different sides, and also to try and find common ground where that is possible, perhaps in places that you didn't expect. Today is a new day, tomorrow will come, and the many days that follow afterwards. And in days like this, it's time to reflect, but tomorrow it's important to roll up your sleeves and get involved in whatever way you can. Signing off from Washington, D.C. and Capitol Hill. I've been your on-the-ground reporter. My name is Tom Spare. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, wherever you are. After I'd recorded the video, I took an Uber to a sleepy neighbourhood in the north of the city. It was there I met the director of the Museum of Palestinian People. Over the course of roughly 2 hours, I was given a tour de force historiography of Palestine, the founding of Israel, and the interconnecting history of the Levant. The museum, no larger than most museum exhibition spaces, gave a near 3,000 history of Palestine through the mode of artefacts, items of clothing, photos, artwork, jewellery, pottery, and a series of poster boards. I learned about the Balfour Declaration, the role of the British state in preparing Jewish administrators for the creation of a Jewish state, long before the start of World War II. As with my visit to the Martin Luther King Jr. National Historical Park, I learned more in a short 2-hour visit than I had over the entirety of my education. There was a lot of emotion, but also a lot of honesty and reality. It taught me that there's always more than one side to a story. We must remember the people involved, their hopes, their dreams, and their fears. I left the museum a changed person. In the early hours, I'd watched Donald J. Trump's victory speech. In the early afternoon, I toured the Capitol building. In the late afternoon, I was given a history of Palestine, Israel, and the Levant. Exhausted from the lack of sleep and the many thousands of steps walking, I didn't have the capacity then to take in that momentous day. I'd witnessed an election and been around two buildings that tell very different versions of history. A new president that was likely to be backing Israel in its efforts to drive out Palestinians from their homelands. A Capitol building that had hosted debates that had repeatedly voted to send billions of dollars of lethal aid to Israel. And a small museum offering a balanced, fair, and rich history that made the very valid argument that the Palestinians' forebears had walked the earth before the ancestors of the modern-day Israelis, that many empires had come and gone, and the Palestinian people had always endured. As I made my way back to the hotel, I pondered how much longer the Palestinians could endure the devastating and relenting force of the Israeli Defense Force, and seemingly the unending support of US economic and military aid. On returning to my hotel, I noted the Groucho Marx quote by the reception desk. Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. In that moment, I couldn't think of a truer quote. Through most of my trip, I'd not stayed out much beyond 10 p.m. It was a safety thing. Travelling solo late at night was never a good combination. However, there were lots of thoughts running through my head about the election result, my visit to the Capitol building and the Museum of Palestinian People. I went for a swift walk which took me to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, where Dr. King made his famous I Have a Dream speech. It was here I sought solace and found quiet contemplation with the looming, illuminated, stark white marble statue of the 16th President of the United States. There were lots of places that have stuck with me over my two visits to the United States. Dr. King's statue in DC, Orchard House, the home of Little Women writer Louisa May Alcott, or the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. But there's not many places that have brought so much inspiration and, in a weird way, a profound sense of gratitude than the Lincoln Memorial. It is, for one, a beautiful dedication to a vital US president. It's a tragic monument because I think of perhaps if Lincoln had lived, the country may well have put to bed its demons and fought forever thereafter to unite around an idea of prosperity for all. But I'm comforted by the legacy of the integrity of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln once said, "I'm not bound to win, but I am bound to be true. I'm not bound to succeed, but I'm bound to live by the light that I have. I must stand with anybody that stands right, and stand with him while he is right, and part with him when he goes wrong." On that night, I found myself pondering where the next Lincoln might come from. A man, a woman, or person who could possess the convictions and moral courage to face down the great evils of our time. I did not hear the wise words of Honest Abe whispering to me of any names, nor did I find the answers to the questions I was asking him. So I headed back to the hotel. On November the 7th, I took an Amtrak train to New York, my final destination of the trip before heading home. The ticket collector informed me I was on the wrong train. I'd boarded the slightly earlier Amtrak. It was parked next to my booked train. Luckily, I was able to hop off at a station on the way, and 10 minutes later, my actual train arrived. I felt like an idiot for making such a rookie mistake, which took the joy out of my last train trip of the journey stateside. November the 8th. I did not have much planned for my last day and a half of my trip. So, on the morning of the 8th of November, I recorded an episode of the Political Dispatch with Sid and Lily, reflecting on the election result. I visited the Empire State Building, a dream of mine since the age of 7, after seeing the Empire State Building represented in Lego form in a book my mum had bought me. I managed to squeeze in a second meal in 2 days to the Piazza restaurant in Lower Manhattan. I wandered over to the fire station where the Ghostbusters exteriors were filmed. November the 9th. On my last morning in New York, I headed to the Tenement Museum on Orchard Street, close to Chinatown. The Tenement Museum imaginatively tells the story of immigration and migration to the US through social history, a preserved block of tenement buildings and passionate guides who bring the past to life. I chose the tour 100 years apart. The guide helped us explore the lives of 2 immigrant women who'd coped with economic hardship in 2 eras. Through the stories of Natalie Gumpertz and Mrs. Wong, we heard about these 2 really inspiring women living a century apart who shared similar struggles, hopes, and survival strategies as they made new lives while working in New York City's garment industry. We visited the recreated 1880s tenement apartment of Gumpert's family, whose primary breadwinner disappeared during the Panic of 1873, and then Natalie Gumpert took over the running of the household and started her own business. And then we skipped ahead 100 years to the 1980s to Chinatown's garment shop that had connected us to the memories of Mrs. Wong, her children, and her co-workers. Mrs. Wong's family still lived next door. In Natalie Gumpert's and Mrs. Wong, I thought of Bruce Springsteen's song American Land, which speaks of the immigrant experience in the United States. They died building the railroads, worked to the bones and skin. They died in the fields and factories, names scattered in the wind. They died to get here 100 years ago. They're dying now. The hands that built the country were always trying to keep down. The new administration was going to target migrant and immigrant communities, ignoring the incredible impact they've made on American life and culture. I returned to my hotel, retrieved my suitcase and effects before being picked up by a pre-booked taxi and was taken to the airport. I boarded the flight to London Heathrow.
Smaller bags must be placed under the seat in front of you. If you are sitting in a front row seat or in an emergency exit room, the floor area must be completely clear for takeoff. Once your handbag is...
On my return journey, I flicked through the speeches of the presidents up to Biden. I nodded off a fair few times, more to do with the quality of my sleep in recent days than the contents of the speeches themselves. I did learn in reading the speeches that the longest inaugural speech was given by the shortest serving US president, William Henry Harrison, who served for 31 days, dying from exposure to the cold. Harrison was the last US president born before the 13 colonies became an independent nation from the British. As we made our final approach, dawn came, a faint band of light at first, and a glowing fire, a furnace, blood red and orange, burning on the horizon. The fiery orange, red strip divided heaven above from the blanket of marble skies and the mortal earth below. Alchemy turns the raging red to a dusty pink. The sky lightened above as we flew towards the day, the night fading behind us. We broke through the clouds, the lights of London revealed a city waking as dawn was breaking. The plane descended, the landing gear engaged, the craft rumbled, wheels hitting the tarmac. We landed back in the UK. Epilogue. As I reflect now on my trip to the US, a trip that took in New York, New Orleans, Atlanta and Washington, D.C., I think of that Trump rally in New York, the election results itself and everything that has followed. Since my trip, Donald Trump has taken the oath of president for the second time. He's appointed tech billionaire Elon Musk to root out cost savings in the US government, and then there was a bit of a fallout and he's left since. He appointed Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to Health Secretary. He's proposed closing the Department of Education. Thousands of immigrants and migrants are being targeted by ICE agents. Trump has flirted with economic disaster by inflicting punishing tariffs on countries around the world. Genocidal acts in Gaza and other parts of Palestine are leading to the mass starvation of thousands. And Trump has done very little to deter the Israelis from pursuing the occupation of Gaza City. A whole swathe of executive orders and bills have pushed the limits of the US presidency, and Congress has passed Trump's big, beautiful bill that will give the richest in American society tax cuts while piling on trillions of debt to the US and removing vital government programs, health initiatives, and denying healthcare access to some of the poorest in society. Despite all this, Trump has an approval rating at the time of recording of 46%, higher than most of President Biden's presidency. In foreign policy, Trump seeks the Nobel Prize, negotiating an end to hostilities between India as one route, Israel and Palestine another, and the war in Ukraine, the third of a triad of conflicts dominating his agenda. So much has happened since I came back from the US. We live in a troubled time in a troubled world. Despite all this, there's been limited resistance to Trump's overreach, and the courts have pulled their punches, often ruling in the president's favour. The searing voice and critic came from none other than Bruce Springsteen. In May, the musician spoke twice extensively during the first gig in Manchester about the state of America, and here's what he said. Now, there's some very weird, strange and dangerous shit going on out there right now. In America, They are persecuting people for using the right to free speech and voicing their dissent. This is happening now. In America, the richest men are taking the satisfaction in abandoning the world's poorest children to sickness and death. This is happening now. In my country, they're taking sadistic pleasure in the pain they inflict on loyal American workers. They're rolling back historic civil rights legislation that led to more just and plural society. They're abandoning our great allies and siding with dictators against those struggling for their freedom. They're defunding American universities that won't bow down to their ideological demands. They're removing residents off American streets and without due process or law are deporting them to foreign detention centres and prisons. This is all happening now. A majority of our elected representatives have failed to protect the American people from the abuses of an unfit president and a rogue government. They have no concern or idea of what it means to be deeply American. The America that I've sung to you for 50 years is real, and regardless of its faults, is a great country with a great people. So we'll survive this moment. Now, I hope, because I believe in the truth of what the great American writer James Baldwin said. In this world, there isn't as much humanity as one would like, but there's enough. As I conclude this series, that has taken me from New York City to New Orleans, from NOLA to Atlanta, on to Washington, D.C., and finishing in New York City, I think of the clouds that circle the United States. I think of Springsteen's speech, the actions of the Trump administration, the perils faced by our world, war, forced starvation, genocide, tech billionaires running circles around governments, climate breakdown. And I think too of another great American songwriter, Bob Dylan, and his song, Not Dark Yet. There's not even room enough to be anywhere. It's not dark yet, but it's getting there. In Trump's America, it's not quite dark yet, but we're certainly getting there. Thanks for listening to Going Spare in the USA, Part 4, Election Night in DC. I'm Tom Spare. I wrote, edited and produced this episode. Additional editing by Emily Merry. The music is by Wondershare Filmora. This has been a Be The Change Media Network production. Thanks for listening.